because there's sometimes a misapprehension, a misunderstanding perhaps, that to be creative in magazines you have to do something totally different. Could we say that there's a kind of visual language of magazines, there's a language of magazines that you can use to express yourself? So there's nothing wrong with saying, I saw that in a magazine, it was great, and that would be great for what I want to say. So that, you're obviously a very creative person, a creative editor, that's how you work then, I guess. You kind of, you seek inspiration from around you and translate it into a magazine form, I suppose. Yeah, totally. And the thing about magazines is you've got to appreciate magazines are a language. There's a reason why things are the way they are in a magazine. It's not because everybody's stultified and conservative and we haven't got any new ideas. It's because we're speaking a language to the reader, and the reader, when they pick up a magazine, they know how a magazine works. They can operate a magazine. Operating a magazine is no different from operating an iPad. You've got to know how it works. You've got to get used to the things that it does and the things that it doesn't. And once your reader has got used to that, with all the millions and millions of magazines that they've ever seen in their life, it's no good just throwing something completely different at them and going, oh, but this is better, you'll love this, because they won't understand how to use it. So you've got to stick to that visual language. It's one of my frustrations actually at the moment. I've just started working on a magazine again that I worked on years ago, and I've had this experience before when I start on a new magazine and somebody else has been running it before, and you get the templates, and I'm a stickler for templates. If I'm redesigning a magazine, everything is templated, everything is gridded. If I'm laying out a magazine, it's all on a 4 or 5mm grid, the whole page is gridded up, you know exactly where everything goes. Of course, once you've got that, you can then break it as much as you like, you can diverge from it. But unless you start off with that structure and that grid and the understanding of what elements are on the page, I've got my body copy, I've got my box outs, I've got my pull quotes, I've got my headlines, I've got my stand firsts. All of these things are part of the visual and content language, part of the semantics of magazines. And unless you've got those nailed down, even trying to be creative around it is just a waste of time, because you're just wallowing in a big mass of nothing. You've got to have those rigid bones there first, and that's really important to understand, even though it might be a bit boring. But yes, the way to make it less boring is, if you don't want to get involved in all that, dull stuff about what goes where on the page, just steal it. Almost literally, obviously we do have to worry about copyright in the magazine business, but page layouts of all things, it's pretty unlikely anybody's going to have a go at you for stealing their page layout. The fact that they've put that there, and that there, and that there, and it works, well, go and do that then. If you come up with a better idea later, by all means, do your better idea, but start off with something that works, even if you have to nick it. Yeah, I think that's really sound advice, and I think also it's interesting to talk about structure and having that kind of backbone through the magazine. Another aspect in terms of a launch, or devising a concept for a mag that's going to spread right through the whole spine of it, pick on different sections and highlight them, is thinking about the product as a whole. Because there's one issue where you can write a piece of text, and then you kind of have to helicopter out of that and say, how would that work on a page? And then the role of the editor, the launch editor especially, is to helicopter out further and say, how does the whole product work? So do you think about a little bit about kind of pacing in magazines? A lot of editors talk about the pace of the magazine. How does that play out? Do you have a sort of methodology for that? Do you kind of always sort of, well, I'll start with some really dense content and I'll let it breathe, or how does it work? Well, I think it works in a number of different ways. When you plan your magazine out, when you template your magazine, you should be creating a sense of pace there. So most magazines will have a busy newsy section at the front, and then it will go into some more long form featurey stuff, and then nearer the back it will come back into more tabulated stuff and your reviews and the things that are in regular formats. So there's always a pace to a magazine, and again, the reader will be familiar with the kind of ways that pacing works, so you should be aware of their expectations, and if you're going to challenge their expectations, then by all means do that, but be aware that that's what you're doing, don't just leave them floundering. So that should give you a certain structure which is pretty much the same for every issue. But then within that, you're still thinking about pace. For example, if you've got 3 features in an issue, then you want to make sure they've all got a different tone. You don't want them all to kind of blend into one. Say you're going to have one long one short one medium one, or you're going to have one that's laid out in a very busy, bitty way so that people can dip into it, but then the next one's going to be big chunks of text. And that gives you some sense of pace. When we say pace in magazines,
we don't expect people to sit down and read the magazine from front to back. So it's not paced like in a marathon where you're sort of calculating what's my reader doing now. That's not really it, because your reader will read half the magazine and chuck it in the loo and find it 3 weeks later and read the rest. So it's not kind of guiding them through it at a set pace. It's just having different things, and partly it's being aware that your reader is fickle. So they'll pick up the magazine and they'll be in a particular mood, and they might want something bitty when they're in that mood, or they might want something long form. Give them something that's going to suit whatever mood they're in. If they're flicking through it, they've got to find all this stuff. They've got to find something that hits them and grabs them in that particular mood. And the great thing about a magazine is, once they've read that thing, they might shut the magazine down again, but they'll pick it up 2 days later and they'll be in a different mood, and they'll go to that next article. So that's really what we mean by pace. It's just having that variety in it, which is really what magazines are all about.
And is it a challenge then to vary pace and tone and keep an overall togetherness for the title? Is that one of the core challenges for an editor, do you think?
It can be, although I think if it becomes a challenge, I think something's already wrong. You know, it should kind of come naturally. I'm wary of saying that because it makes it sound like you don't have to think about it, and you do. But if you've got a really clear sense of what your magazine's voice is and what your magazine's point is, it's a bit like, well, I think it's a lot like actually writing a character in a play or a screenplay. If you really know that character well, you'll know what they're going to do next, you'll know what they're not going to do next. You know, somebody can come up to, well, I mean, if you watch a soap, you'll know if somebody says to you, would X do Y? You know that person wouldn't do that, or they would do that. And if the scriptwriter makes them do something that they wouldn't do, you'll spot it straight away. And it's the same with magazines. You should know, what would we say, what wouldn't we say, how would we approach this article, how wouldn't we approach this article? You know, is that an L kind of angle on it or not? And this is exactly the conversations that people will have sitting around in editorial meetings, which can get to sound rather pretentious, but it's this sense of we know what we are. And again, communicating that to the reader is so valuable, because that's what the reader's buying into. So you should have a clear sense of, even though all these things are different, even though they're paced differently, even though they're very different topics, we've still got that kind of clear voice, we've got a sense of identity.
And I mean, we've done some work on redesign, and obviously you've got a lot of experience in that sort of sphere, and that kind of we started focusing on kind of identifying what the magazine is now, how effectively it does its job, and then identifying a vision for where it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's kind of similar for launch in that you're going from zero to hero.
Yeah.
How do you go about that process of kind of saying, you know, this is the vision, and how do you create a kind of touchstone, that referencing point that says this is a PC Gear type way, you know, approach to this, or a Mac user handling of this feature? How do you build that? Is that just something that kind of evolves, or do you consciously create that?
It does evolve, and I think it's really important when you do